joining us for a special ADU edition of Mornings with Planning to kick off our Louisville and Lexington ADU conference. I want to introduce myself. My name is Chris Woodall. I'm the manager of long range planning for the city of Lexington. I want to welcome you to the first of 6 sessions that will be happening over the next couple of days that will help you all understand, first of all, what accessory dwelling units or ADUs are. We'll also provide answers to questions for those of you in the real estate, lending, building and design and appraisal industries. But before I go too far, I want to give some special thanks out to, first of all, the city of Louisville for helping us put forward this joint venture. Both of us have recently passed ADU ordinances in 2021, and we're looking for ways to sort of jumpstart production on those ADUs. So our answer was to bring in some national industry experts to answer some of the questions that you all have about this relatively new housing type in our markets. So both Louisville and Lexington realized we had some joint goals and a shared interest, and so we appreciate them helping to organize, set up, and run this conference with us. Also, I want to thank AARP Kentucky for partnering on this project. They've contributed support for ADUs both locally and nationally, and have contributed funding, outreach, and other support for a multitude of Lexington and Louisville's projects related to ADU education. And they've actually helped us with funding for our keynote speaker. So with that, I'd like to welcome everyone to a special ADU edition of Mornings with Planning, where the cities of Louisville and Lexington are taking advantage of the virtual webinar platform to be able to reach a broad audience of industry folks who are interested in the topic of ADUs. All of these sessions will be recorded live for later viewing at www.imaginelexington.com, and as mentioned earlier, are eligible for AICP credit. During the webinar, we'll learn the basics of both Louisville and Lexington's ADU regulations and the work and coordination required by planning staffers to get each proposal to an approval. Elected officials from each city will also discuss the necessary partnerships, advocacy efforts, and the political approach involved in the process. So kick back with your morning coffee or tea, and we'll meet today's panelists. First is Councilwoman Nicole George. In November of 2018, Nicole George was elected to represent the people of District 21 on the Louisville Metro Council. After redistricting in 2020, the district includes neighborhoods of Beachmont, Wilder Park, Iroquois, Southside, Belmar, Preston Park, Sunshine Acres, my old Kentucky home, and the city of Linview. The district also encompasses the Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport and the Kentucky Exposition Center. In 2022, she serves as the chair of the Metro Council's Public Works Committee. She's also a member of the Planning and Zoning, Equity and Inclusion, and Budget Committees. She has spent her career working with families to improve child safety and well-being. For over 15 years, Nicole has worked as a public servant, delivering both frontline services and child protection, and holding an array of child welfare administrative roles. These jobs have focused on organization improvement, policy analysis, and project management. Nicole spearheaded a statewide initiative to reduce trauma and enhance behavioral health services for children in foster care. And Nicole is professionally trained to use available assets to drive positive change. Nicole values the ability of community to enhance the lives of all its citizens and support them in reaching their potential. Nicole is a lifelong resident of the South End, Louisville, and has been married for 2 decades to small business owner and IBEW Local 369 member, Ricky George. Nicole George is an avid runner, outdoor enthusiast, and is committed to serving the citizens of Metro Council District 21 through her leadership in economic growth and maintaining the beauty of the Metro 21 district. Thank you for joining us, Councilwoman George. Councilmember Hannah Legree was elected as Lexington's 3rd District Urban County Council representative in November 2020. In addition to her service on the council, Hannah works as a career counselor and educator at the University of Kentucky, where she helps undergraduate students explore career options and learn to engage meaningfully with their communities. She holds a BA in English from the College of Worcester and an MA in English from the University of Kentucky. She moved to Lexington at the beginning of her career to serve as an AmeriCorps Vista in youth literacy programming. She has over a decade of experience in the nonprofit, private, and educational sectors. She currently serves on several nonprofit boards, including the International Book Project and Civic Lex. In her personal life, Hannah is invested in the literary and creative arts. She's an avid pedestrian and bicycle commuter and likes experiencing the city at a human pace. Hannah lives in the Minto Park neighborhood where she enjoys talking to her neighbors, frequenting local businesses, and spending time with her partner, Andrew. Thank you, Councilmember Legree. Now on to our planning staff. Joel Dock, AICP, is a planning coordinator for Louisville Metro Planning and Design Services. He graduated from the University of Louisville's Department of Geography and Geosciences in 2013, where he concentrated in urban and regional analysis. He was the recipient of the Lou Sieg Award in Geography, as well as the Best Senior Thesis Award in 2012 and 13. Applying geographic methods to city planning, along with a knowledge of regulatory practices attained through a professional career, has enabled Joel to develop a comprehensive understanding of how historic land use regulations have shaped modern city landscapes. His daily responsibilities include the review of zoning map amendments, development plans, and major subdivisions. Glad to have you, Joel. And last but not least, we have Chris Taylor, who's an administrative officer with the City of Lexington's Long Range Planning section. He has a degree in economics from the University of Kentucky. He's been with our planning division for over 15 years. In his most recent role, he was instrumental in the completion of the city's newest comprehensive plan, Imagine Lexington, which provides for creative infill and redevelopment within the nation's first urban service boundary. Currently, he's working to revise Lexington's zoning ordinance to provide considerably more housing opportunities. Thank you, Chris Taylor, for joining us today. So with that, that's a good segue. More housing opportunities, a good segue to bring us into our first question. And I know you all are tired of hearing me ramble on. So without further ado, we'll get right into the discussion here. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. So both, as I mentioned, both Louisville and Lexington have both recently passed ADU ordinances within the past year. So Joel, we'll start the conversation with you. Can you tell us exactly what ADUs are? Give us kind of a baseline understanding of what they are for the benefit of our audience. And then how and why the ADU regulations came to be in your jurisdiction.
Great. Yeah, first and foremost, thank you for having Louisville involved in this conference, and thanks to AARP and the City of Lexington for putting this together and having myself and Councilwoman George a part of this panel. It's really a great opportunity to spread some education and the word about ADUs. So I'm going to describe ADUs, and then I'm going to take it backwards a little bit and describe why ADUs came to be, and talk a little bit about zoning. So an ADU, an accessory dwelling, an accessory apartment, it's a second small home on your property, which is, it's incidental to your primary home. So it's smaller than your main home. It could be in the backyard. ADUs are known as granny flats or backyard cottages, carriage houses. It could be a basement or a garage conversion to a small apartment, a third story or attic conversion. It could also be, a new addition to your home. It's just really any new smaller apartment on your home. When you think about it, it's not a very complex definition. So we're excited to have our ADU ordinance recently adopted. So why do we have ADUs? Why are we talking about ADUs? So zoning is what drives our ADU ordinance and our accessory dwelling unit ordinance. And, zoning is the law that dictates how land can be used. And every parcel of land in Louisville and in Lexington are divided into zones. They're divided into specific categories of land use. Well, in the state of Kentucky, in order for a city, a jurisdiction, a town to have zoning, we have to have what's called a comprehensive plan. A comprehensive plan is your guiding document of shared ideas that the community has provided input on, that guides land use decisions. So it guides, amendments to your zoning map. It also guides the text of your zoning law. And so once you have a comprehensive plan, you can have a zoning map, and you can have a text that then says how each, area, each zone can be used. In the city of Louisville, that text is called the Land Development Code. And within that land development code, each zone of the map is identified, and then the land development code lays out how then each zone can be used. And that's all rooted in following the guidance of the comprehensive plan. So how did we get to this point with accessory dwelling units? So, accessory dwelling units have been identified as an alternative form of housing, beginning with the comprehensive plan of Cornerstone 2020, adopted in 2000, and then carrying forward to the most recent plan, Plan 2040, which takes a greater housing, and puts a greater emphasis on housing, specifically alternative housing and housing choice. So Plan 2040 became effective January 1st, 2019. Accessory dwelling units were also identified in several, planning documents, including the Advancing Equity Report in April of 2019. And then a land development diagnosis was performed by Opticos Design. Opticos Design, Daniel Perelic, who is keynoting, was involved in that land development code diagnosis, as that was the firm that performed it, which also identified accessory dwelling units and the need to expand our single family zones to our alternative housing choices. So from these documents, national trends and best practices, as well as calls to action surrounding the racial and social justice movements of 2020, the Louisville Metro Planning Commission, Metro Council, and the Mayor's administration requested that the planning office undertake a review of the land development code and make recommendations to reform that land development code to create more equitable and inclusive land use and development rules. So one of the first items that we took on was accessory dwelling units. It was a pretty simple choice to bring that forward as really the first initial step in breaking down inequitable barriers. So prior to the change in 2021, ADUs were only permitted after an intensive public hearing process through the Board of Zoning Adjustment, and that was through our conditional use permit process. After the change, ADUs are now allowed by right if they meet special standards in our single family zoning district. So I did note that this is the initial first step in breaking down these barriers to allow for alternative forms of housing. We do see ADUs as a form of housing to support the aging population, younger folks in their transitional years, single parents, multi-generational and varying family arrangements, as well as providing a source of income to offset the cost of mortgage and just generally increasing the supply of housing and housing choices and opportunity.
Great.
I'll say for the city of Lexington.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
No, you go right on ahead, Chris.
I was going to say for the city of Lexington, our foray into accessory dwelling units really started about 15, 17 years ago with the creation of an infill and redevelopment steering committee that was aimed at trying to relieve some of our zoning requirements to just allow any sort of infill development in our urban core. That process led to a number of zoning ordinance text amendments, which is a fancy way of saying just changes to our zoning text to allow different smaller lot sizes, smaller setbacks, different things like that for regular redevelopment. But it also brought up for the first time in Lexington the idea of an accessory dwelling unit. And that idea really didn't even get past the planning commission stage. A lot of those text changes from the infill and redevelopment steering committee sort of flew through the planning commission and the council process. But the accessory dwelling units, it was mostly just the planners talking about this as something that we wanted to add to that. We made the case for it from an affordable housing standpoint, for all sorts of reasons, and it didn't have any traction. The community was not ready for it. I think people largely didn't understand it, and it sort of died there around 2008, 2009 for us. But when we were working on the last comprehensive plan, the 2018 comprehensive plan, as part of our outreach to various stakeholder groups in the community, our Senior Services Commission brought it back to us as something that was very important to them. It was near the top of their agenda for things that were critical to them, and they were looking at soaring costs of senior housing. It was something that most of their membership was very concerned about, and they were looking for a way to stay in their neighborhoods and stay in their homes if at all possible, as well as to have the option for bringing in caregivers, as well as supplementing their income through the rental income stream of having an ADU. And so we took on with the completion of the 2018 comprehensive plan. That was one of the first implementation steps that we started to work on through our Senior Services Commission and through a grant with AARP, just working on education and outreach and the creation of an educational manual just to talk about what ADUs were, to build some awareness around the issue, and as well just to talk about best practices, sort of gold standard ordinances nationally, what other cities and states have been doing for decades that we're sort of behind on, and trying to set appropriate expectations. So I think that was sort of the genesis of Lexington's work, was having a partner that was really committed to seeing it through, that was an important constituency in the community.
But I think it's interesting that both of these sort of originated from different places, right? Ours in Lexington sort of came from a partnership with a constituency after having the staff had explored it, perhaps a decade before, but now a constituency had sort of emerged that was interested in that, whereas the Metro Council was sort of directing a review of the ordinances in Lexington to sort of break down some of the barriers. So there was sort of a different genesis for each of these different ADU policies that were coming up. But I think what's important, that even though you had a different issue in both places, that education became very important. And ADUs are not something new. I know, Joel, you were talking about this as something that had emerged as sort of a newer housing type of things, but we know that this is a historic housing type as well that's been around a long time, but has sort of ceased to exist in most places and sort of re-emerging. So I guess there was a lot of education that needed to take place in order to, though there were some pockets of folks who understood sort of what we were trying to do, the general public at large probably had quite a few things. So, real quick from a staff perspective, what did you all hear? What were some of your educational, opportunities and avenues that you all took, Joel, Chris?
I can tell you real quick, we could do a whole webinar series on how we've backslid to this point where we have to legalize ADUs. Joel has an excellent presentation on that is a great corollary to this, but that's really where we start, is at least when I talk with neighborhoods and residents, is, well, how we got here, what used to be legal, why can't they do this to begin with? And that sort of background, I think, is really important in understanding that this all used to be legal, used to be common, and through a number of various reasons, it no longer is, and it has an impact on affordability and what some of the long-term impacts on our communities have been as a result of the zoning practices that are in place. And so for my part, I like to start there because I think it's really important. I think people are very interested in understanding the why of what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve with some of these and how we got to this point.
Yeah, and Chris, I like that you mentioned the, historic practices. I mean, a lot of I think what we're doing now with housing is just re-legalizing what already exists and made many of our communities so vibrant, made them, sustainable in a sense, makes them eclectic, makes them walkable, makes them dense, make them affordable. So, I mean, around the turn of the rush to adopt zoning practices across the country, all of the land uses were separated from each other, and single family became, essentially a tool for exclusionary practices, and said, everything needed to be separated from each other, including ADUs, multifamily, duplexes, boarding homes. They all needed to be separate from each other. Businesses needed to be separate from each other. And much of that has to do with, racism and discrimination. And so we see ADUs as another form to build equity, to provide housing, and to break down some of those barriers of decades of discrimination in land use and zoning.
Well, and sure, we sort of talk about a shift in some mindset, right, from something being historically allowed to then it being excluded, and now we're talking about it again, which is sort of another paradigm shift, which means that that education is important, but there are also a lot of practical concerns that come up through the conversation of changing a land use that is different than what's been there before. And I know our elected officials on the call here have to respond to their constituents and the concerns that they have that are very real concerns. So I wonder, Nicole, if you could speak to sort of the experience in Louisville that you've had. What are some of the concerns that were raised? And then Hannah will kick to you after that.
Thank you. And it'll be interesting to see the difference between the two cities. I think on the front end, I just want to say, Chris mentioned the importance of readiness, and for Lexington, when this work started, I will say, in Louisville, planning and design did a really effective job at laying the groundwork so that while timing is everything, and of course we did have calls for social justice, we also were prepared, and that groundwork had been laid with the series of reports. Several of my colleagues and I had also become exposed to this as part of some of the Congress for New Urbanism we had hosted, I believe, in 2019, and first were able to get exposed to some of Jeff Speck's work and some of the ideas around missing middle. So I think that also helped lay the groundwork for then what is inevitable, and that is the concerns. In my community, I heard lots of concerns around the notification process, this idea that ADUs would be permitted versus going through the conditional use permit, and therefore this idea that neighbors would not be notified when that happens, would not have a voice in the process. I think the second concern we heard from was around issues with how to address environmental constraints. So for instance, in the permitting process, what happens when you have an area that has environmental constraints, and how would that be flagged? The third issue that we heard really was just around concentrating need in certain neighborhoods. So in Louisville, of course, we have lots of local municipalities, lots of neighborhoods with deed restrictions and homeowners associations. And so invariably there's concerns around in our neighborhoods that have disinvestment, that are more fragile just in the way of any sort of change in the system, how that would be accommodated for, making sure that we're not just, again, concentrating more need, throwing up more housing that doesn't reflect quality and doesn't have the support needed. So that would, the other piece that I would say was that you can never do enough engagement. And of course, these changes happen during a pandemic. And so despite planning and design taking every step possible to get out and engage, and poor Joel had meeting after meeting and evening meetings, but it really is always a challenge. It's for any sort of system, you're going to catch the people most engaged, and there's going to be those folks who weren't paying attention until it really starts to move through the media. And so I would say that's always a challenge.
Certainly. And Hannah, do you want to talk to some of the challenges in Lexington's and concerns that you heard?
Sure, I'd be glad to, Chris. Chris Taylor shared a little bit about the history of this issue, and when I came into office, ADUs had been actively in committee since 2019. And I think one of the challenges or the opportunities that we had in engaging with my district, for example, would be to share accurate information about how the legislation had changed, even during the past 2 years. Our planning department and council members had been very responsive to some of the concerns that had already been brought forward. We had a lot of questions about regulation. For example, one of the changes that had been made was that people needed to go through a pre-application process. So that was something that I still had questions about when I came into office. What is the process? How has it been updated? I think we also had questions about environmental concerns in terms of stormwater or our neighborhood systems being able to handle more density. And then we had a number of questions about things like parking, the ability to regulate these structures so that the owner occupancy requirement, which was again in response to neighborhood constituent concerns, could be enforced. And then questions about quality of life, design, a little bit about protecting the R1 status. And Joel, I think that you spoke to the history of R1 and Chris very thoughtfully. We had concerns about additional renters in areas where there were fewer renters. And I think that our planning department worked very thoughtfully with me as a council member to spread accurate information, to be responsive to the concerns. And I know that they did the same with other council members in other districts. And those concerns took different forms in different districts. I represent a very urban area that also covers the University of Kentucky. So those are some of the bits of information that I was hearing from constituents, some of which had already been addressed through additional changes in the legislation, and some of which were addressed in conversation and then with the additional changes later in the process. So we had a lot of evolution to our ADU regulations over a period of years, which I'm not sure if you all are going to speak to the difference between ADUs in Lexington and in Louisville and how they're allowed to exist, but I think that might be helpful for the audience as well.
Why don't we lean on our staffers for that one and talk about perhaps a little bit about your experience in the evolution of how things changed working with your council and on the process and how we got to where we are.
Well, I could say that, we started like I said, with our educational campaign to really do a gold standard ordinance. And there's so much history now from other cities and states that have been doing ADUs for a lot longer, that we could really see the evolution of legislation, and we could see sort of their starting point and to some places to a place where there's some very mature and well adopted and very productive ADU ordinances that are now generating a significant percentage of their overall housing market are coming from that product type. And so we had that experience to point to and show folks what you could look for as sort of a best practice. But we also knew that some of those best practice standards that had been adopted in other cities had been hard fought battles there too. But it gave us the opportunity to educate on those and explain why ordinances were the way they were. And in particular, I know, and for our efforts, we worked for months and months explaining why we did not think that an owner occupancy requirement was good policy for a number of reasons. But we also understood that was something that just about every other city that had ever done ADUs had probably started with an owner occupancy requirement. It was something that was a good baby step in the right direction to getting a housing policy adopted. And it was something that ultimately our planning commission, before it was moved on to the council, added that restriction. And so, we saw other restrictions added when it came time to the council hearings. There was concerns about, an extreme proliferation of new detached ADUs, and while those of us that talk about these things at length and all the time, we know that detached ADUs and detached structures are the most expensive structures to build. The barriers to financing and getting those projects built are enormous. And so, we knew that was not very likely, but in terms of getting the community ready for ADUs as a whole, we put a restriction on our ADU ordinance that basically only allows for detached ADUs in a conversion for an existing structure. And, we're already seeing lots of folks that are interested in doing something around that. Because if they have one, it's a lot cheaper to convert than it is to build a new one. But those types of restrictions, I think, were very instrumental in giving the public and our elected officials comfort in moving something forward. And, for our standpoint, moving something forward, getting a start is ultimately what we're trying to do. It's iterations and baby steps and slow improvements to our ordinance. A couple of other things that we put on the ordinance, I think, to get it to where it is today is, planning staff had no problem putting a restriction on short-term rentals on an ADU. That still has to go for a conditional use permit, and we think that's completely justified. That sort of use is basically a commercial use in a residential zone, and that's a perfect application for a conditional use permit. That's consistent with how we treat regular bed and breakfasts. So that was sort of an easy thing. The restriction we put on was the form of a deed restriction that's in favor of the urban county government that aids in sort of enforcement of the other types of use issues. And so those types of restrictions, I think, were pretty important in communicating to the public that it wasn't going to be a free for all, and that there would be some opportunities for iteration over time.
Joel, you want to talk about some of the responses that you all had, the evolution of your proposal as well?
I do, and I think it's going to mirror a lot of what, Chris mentioned. I mean, first and foremost, get short-term rentals out of the way. I mean, our housing needs assessment in 2019 indicated that short-term rentals suppress long-term housing choice and availability. So, the purpose of our equity review and bringing ADUs forward were to further housing choice and help with housing affordability. So short-term rentals was an easy item to mark off. You have to ask for a conditional use permit to allow your accessory apartment to be used as a short-term rental. I think when we start the ADU regulation, I think we started with some easier items. How do we keep it subordinate? So we started with a size. 800 square feet is our maximum size, or 30% of the home if you've got a much larger home. So we start there. We looked at orientation. We didn't want ADUs facing alleys because there's no pedestrian infrastructure back there. So we need it oriented towards the yard. We need the access to come from the public streets. We looked at height, again, height and size, subordinate. So a couple easier things to mark off. And then we tackled, some of the harder questions. Again, short-term rentals wasn't really a harder question, but, we also wanted to ensure that, individuals investing in ADUs to expand, rental housing were free and clear of any property maintenance violations, and that having an ADU on a property wouldn't exacerbate an existing property maintenance violation from housing upkeep to lawn maintenance. So we required that all violations be, mitigated, and you can't have any within, the last 12 months of applying. We have the same issues with, the ownership provision, and council and staff had long and hard conversations about the ownership provision. I mean, the concern with the ownership provision is everything from, absentee ownership. And then, concerns about once we have the ownership provision, what's that do for future enforcement? Once an individual moves and wants to sell the property, there's issues surrounding, from an equity perspective, are we limiting the supply of rental units or choices? There was just simply a trade-off there with, taking a step that most cities have taken where we added the ownership provision. Now, the one thing that Louisville did do is we kept a conditional use permit option. So we understand that not every ADU application that comes in is going to fit every standard. There might be rare situations where it is a non-owner occupied, or the accessory dwelling unit is larger, but still contextually appropriate. And staff and the Board of Zoning Adjustment are obligated to take a really hard look at those circumstances, because we understand the concerns of council and the community with the ownership provisions, with the size standards. And we really want this regulation to be administered by staff and taken advantage of in the manner that it was written up. We do ultimately believe that, most individuals will come in and comply with the regulations to avoid that rigorous public hearing process that can take up to 6 months.
Well, it really is interesting, given the different paths that we've taken and the different timelines that we took to get to that point, how closely we ended up together. Hannah mentioned that our process in Lexington took every bit of 3 years to get through, and a lot of the changes were made at the Planning Commission level. But then there was a lot of time in between to where the council acted on it. And so there was a lot of education and catch up to do. So Nicole, I wonder from Louisville, how many of it, as we talk about your, as a council woman, your response to your constituents, were a lot of the changes made during the Planning Commission level, or did you all have, feel like you needed to make a lot of changes once the proposal reached you all? How did that process play out?
Well, and feel free, Joel, to jump in. I think there were changes made during the planning process, but I know the specific changes that were most difficult, that I think what Joel referenced, particularly around the owner occupancy requirement, that was done in committee. So, I mean, I would say it was both. And I do just want to, hit on the fact that, again, planning and design did all they could do to get out in front and really engage the community. But there are always limitations with that. And so people finally start paying attention sometimes when things come before the council, and that sometimes drives the need to change within committee.
And Hannah, do you want to sort of chime in a little bit on, what your role was as, coming into with the, the ADU ordinance is already sort of in play and happening, and how you saw your role as a council member in connecting with your constituents?
Yes, thanks, Chris. As I mentioned, this had been kind of a hot issue in 2019, kind of edging into 2020. And then with the pandemic and lots of other factors, it didn't get revisited in full until, moving into 2021. With our process, and Nicole, I'm glad you brought this up, sometimes people start really tuning back in when council starts to engage with an issue, and information's being presented in committee, and votes may occur. So we had a lot of engagement from neighbors and from neighborhoods as this issue was coming back into committee, and we had a special committee meeting where everybody on council became kind of active in committee, even if they weren't in planning and public safety, just to engage with the issue of ADUs. And so I felt very fortunate to have the opportunity to meet multiple times with our planning staff, and I know a number of my colleagues did as well, to make sure that I had accurate information, and then that I could share that information and also align the ADU process with some of the values of my constituents and of the district. I appreciate that Louisville, you all have brought up questions about equity and housing access and housing needs, because those were values that I needed to share with my constituents. But we also worked hard. If neighborhood associations wanted to meet and they wanted to talk about ADUs, I felt as though, yes, I should be there, but that planning staff should be there as well. So we had Zoom meetings. We had one outdoor porch session so that people could enter into conversation with the planning staff and with me, and then, play out some of their concerns or fears and receive feedback and information from me and from the staff. So we also had people come and speak in chambers. Council members also had the opportunity to ask a number of questions in multiple forums about ADUs. My goal was, again, to share accurate information, to be responsive, to bring planning staff in when necessary and as often as possible, and to share both actualities of practice and the values that were driving the ADU decision. So that's, and I know Chris, if you want to add anything to that, that was kind of my intent in engaging.
Well, I'll just speak from the planning staff perspective and say that how much we appreciate being able to join you in those conversations. And I wonder, Chris Taylor, if you could walk us through, those neighborhood meetings, can be interesting at times, but always generally a good experience, even though, we may not end with the same conclusion. Walk us through kind of a typical neighborhood meeting, because we had several. How did those go? What were the topics? What was the tenor of conversation, that sort of thing?
Well, they range, and they range based on, whether you're in Hannah's district, which is a more urban district, or if you're in a more suburban district. The questions and the tenor of those conversations change night to night and neighborhood by neighborhood, and with good reason. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of concern, and change is hard. And But Lexington's got some constraints on growth and housing that we have to have some creative solutions on, and we have to have some flexibility on. And every discussion we have with neighborhoods really starts with a why are we doing this, right? Like, I think that's a lot of the frustration we hear from folks is why are you doing this? Why are you trying to mess with or ruin something that's already great? And the thing is, it's great for you, but it's not great for people who can't afford a home. It's not great for, if we can't build enough homes, then we should not be surprised that homelessness is increasing. These are things that have direct line correlations that we have to explain and make the case for why new options are important and why it needs to be done in some form, even if it's a baby step. And those conversations are the same no matter where we are. It's why are we doing this? Why is it important? And those are conversations that in planning we really like having. But those are the conversations we're usually having well before it gets to the planning commission. But it seems like everything sort of changes once it gets to the council. And what's interesting at that point is, it goes from something that is, educational to something that is political. And that's something that, let's be honest, the planners aren't well versed in. And so, it's really important that when people start going to their council members, that, there's still an opportunity for us to correct information. Our role changes there, I think, from one of education or from one of just baseline education to one of explaining the regulations and trying to set appropriate expectations. A lot of, I think, Chris, what we tried to do in the second half of that engagement was just be real honest about the number of ADUs that we expected to see with the regulations that we have in place, because that data is very clear nationally. You can almost, set a bench line for every restriction you put on an ADU ordinance, what those new numbers annually per 10,000 people in a community is going to look like. And, we gave numbers on what we expected that to be. And honestly, we may end up falling short of that, given the restrictions that we have in place. And that's okay. But it's important, I think, to set appropriate expectations for what you expect to see with an ordinance, communicate that clearly to people. They may not believe you, and that's okay. But, that's one of the things that I think the planners have an obligation to have some data in hand. And that helps, I hope, the elected officials with their information. But really, we're just trying to be helpful to the elected officials and decision makers, because they're hearing from people at a scale at that point that's very different than what we've heard from up to that point. People call us when they're upset about it early, but the tenor of those conversations, I think, when they come to their elected officials is very different. And so I'm very, appreciative that they want to engage us in that process, and that hopefully we have something to offer that helps them with their vote, because it's a hard thing to do.
Well, and Joel, I know you've spent a lot of time in neighborhood meetings too. I wonder if you have a shared experience with Chris Taylor, if there's some variation between the two cities.
I think a lot of what's been talked about is very much the same. Change is hard. Understanding rules and rule changes, and specifically how it might impact your property, is a tough pill to swallow sometimes. I think simultaneously, once we have the ordinance adopted, we're not done yet. We're having conferences like this. We're educating the public. If hopefully we have time for Councilwoman George to talk a little bit about the AARP Community Challenge Grant and that we're doing to help build community education. But we also understand that zoning is just kind of the baseline. Zoning just sets the stage for the environment for housing choice and housing to be built. We also have to understand that, ADUs cost money. A lot of ADUs are built with cash resources, taking out equity in your home. And we know from research and the data that access to and attainment to wealth is disproportionately weighted against our communities and families of color. So there needs to be other avenues to leverage ADUs from an equity perspective, from an affordability perspective. There's a number of, different programs out there across the country, from, revolving loan funds to loan forgiveness program. And a lot of those have, affordability standards, attached to them. Are you getting this loan and you need to rent to someone in a low to moderate income, rent to somebody with, a housing choice voucher? There are a number of different ways to do that. One of the more exciting avenues that I'm kind of looking forward to is the concepts of pre-approved building plans and pre-approved ADU plans. And I hope this conference will help to highlight, once a regulation is passed, we see that, a niche market starts to develop for this type of development. So when folks start to specialize in building ADUs, when folks understand how to build ADUs, rent ADUs, market ADUs, the cost can go down. If we have plans approved already that you don't have to go through 5 rounds of review with the permit writers, your cost is going to go way down. So, there's a number of different avenues to make sure that we leverage accessory dwelling units for the purpose that we intended them to serve, which was to expand housing choice and affordability.
Joel, you've done a great job sort of getting us to, we've got about 5 minutes more of conversation and talking about the future of what's next. What kind of interest are we seeing in these, and the educational component is still very important. So Nicole, I wonder if you can speak really quickly to the AARP Challenge Grant that you all have worked for.
Certainly. And so one thing I would say on the front end of this is that I personally have an ADU. My mom has lived 50 feet behind me for the last 18 years. And I've learned a lot in that time period about ways to really spotlight and highlight the benefits of ADUs. And that is to say, any of us could benefit from ADUs at some point in our lives. And we spoke about, generally speaking, from more affordable housing to aging in place. There really is the need to tell the stories and to normalize it. And so Rachel Works, who works with the council office, partnered with planning and design to apply for the challenge grant with AARP. We were awarded that grant, and as part of that work, what we'll see is an array of educational information and promotion around ADUs. Again, telling the stories of people in our community who have ADUs and how that has benefited them. Again, really to be able to scale up who and how the community sees the benefits, and hopefully to inspire action around how do you apply and all those things that Joe spoke of that have sometimes been a barrier to moving forward. So we really hope through education and promotion, we see increased numbers. And I believe we're already seeing some increased numbers, and Joel can speak to that.
Yeah, Joel, you want to talk a little bit more about that? What we're talking about here, obviously we've seen high interest in this particular conference with, like 475 people registering and coming on board. There's a lot of people who are talking about it, want to learn a little bit more. What's the interest? Yeah, we had a question come in from somebody that said there was a lot of concern about a rush for development as soon as the ADU ordinance was passed. Have we seen that? What has been the interest in ADUs that you all have seen?
Yeah, so we've had roughly 20 accessory dwelling units administratively approved since about August. So since the adoption and enactment of the ADU ordinance, we've had about 20. We would have seen that amount in about a 10-year period previously. I think some of those were folks that were expecting the ordinance to come around and maybe were waiting just to see. Others had plans and wanted to bring an ADU forward. So we're excited that we've had a fair amount of them, and we want to keep seeing ADUs built throughout all of our communities.
Chris Taylor, you want to talk about it? What we've been seeing?
Yeah, I think it's been slow. I sort of glance over at my big board of ADU pre-application meetings that I've had, and it's not all that big. It's it's about a dozen, 2 dozen people who've called to be interested, to ask questions. About half of those can't do one for various reasons. Some of them are related to the ordinance, some related to the underlying zoning. But there's all of those. Everyone who's called that has had an interest that couldn't move forward. As far as I'm concerned, there is a policy and ordinance provision solution that's available, if we move that direction over time. But, I've let them know that will take some time. We've only had a couple of people move forward into the actual construction phase. And some of the folks that were ones that had already started on a detached structure before the ordinance was in place and are now coming back and looking to convert that space. And they're beautiful structures. And I think that's part of the story that we'll need to tell as we look to evolve the ordinance is that, there's some of the restrictions are really putting a weight down on these things. But I think it's hard to overlook, some of the pandemic constraints out there related to, the cost of construction materials and finding qualified folks to do the work. The same things that are raising our prices for regular housing are also impacting, ADU construction, because a lot of times these are individual homeowners acting as a developer and general contractor, and that's a hard thing to do in this sort of environment. So I don't think it's any coincidence that our numbers are low, but it's certainly, probably a little below where I expected and hope to be at this time. But I look at those as opportunities to analyze each and every person that comes in and does one as to a way to improve the ordinance over the coming years.
Well, that sort of gets right at the heart of this conference, doesn't it? We're trying to bring in industry professionals to provide the education and the outreach, access to information so that we could try to overcome some of those barriers, whether it's an access to knowledge or whatever it is, trying to provide links and contacts with folks. So unfortunately, I knew this was going to happen because it always happens where the hour just flies by. But I want to thank Councilwoman Nicole George from Louisville for being with us, and Joel from the city of Louisville as well. And then Councilmember Hannah Legree from Lexington, and Chris Taylor from our office too. This has been an excellent start to our conversations, and I hate to cut us off so quickly, but certainly this has been a wonderful discussion. Our next session is going to be at 9:45. We're going to be joined by Bryce Johnner from Haven Construction, who's going to give us some insight on how the design and construction industry might take advantage of the unique market that the ADUs provide.